Thank you, Michael, and thanks to Tom and Penny for the invitation to speak. I'm going to talk about my research in Vancouver, which was in the early 1990s. In fact, I came up as a poor graduate student and was lucky to encounter David Lay, who was an extraordinarily kind mentor to me at that time. So I'm going to start with an anecdote and then talk about some points that I think the anecdote raises, and then lead that from there to discuss some of the questions that Michael raised vis-a-vis immigration, integration, and the shaping of Vancouver. So the anecdote begins with a person spray painting a phrase on a house. The phrase was genius loci, and the house was a so-called monster house in one of the west side neighborhoods of Vancouver. The phrase, as you can imagine, is this, had to come from someone who was relatively well educated and probably wealthy if they're on the west side, reasonably wealthy. And the house that was spray painted on, the monster houses, were very large houses that were built at that time, late 80s and early 90s, that were often considered to be quite ugly, and they were built by developers at least partially for the growing Hong Kong market that David was talking about earlier. So this action of the spray painting, is it an action of citizenship or is it an act of terrorism? And it's interesting to think about the meanings of things like that, determining how we think about that kind of behavior. Was she reacting to the marketization, speculation around housing that was developing that in the context of rapid capital influx that David was talking about? Was she reacting to, was it an expression of Canadian nationalism? This is not the kind of house that Canadians live in. Was it an expression of racism? This is mainly Hong Kong Chinese buyers that are buying these kinds of ugly houses. Or was it purely an aesthetic judgment? So these are the kinds of questions that came up with these cultural struggles and conflicts, or seemingly cultural struggles and conflicts at that time. And what I want to look at is some of the reactions to them. And so these reactions are not to this specific incident, but to sort of what this incident is indicative of in the larger scheme of things. First reaction. Vancouver Planning Department has a bunch of municipal bylaws, zoning, sort of using the law to try to limit the size of houses that can be built in these lots. Okay, also sort of controls the ceiling height, the ratio of the floor space to the lot space, and in other bylaws to regulate things like house style and trees, because another conflict was around the taking down of a lot of shrubbery and trees. So bringing in local government, the law. Okay. Second reaction, and this is really from real estate and development, which gave a lot of money into various kinds of institutes to do what I call push research, where you do ask for research to come up with certain kinds of results that you're interested in having. And I'm giving an example of a nonprofit agency called the Laurier Institute, which is heavily funded by the real estate industry, which was brought in to show that, in fact, the house prices, which was another source of struggle, as David talked about, in the landscape in Vancouver at this time, the house prices were not the result of offshore investment, offshore buying and turning houses into exchange value than use value, but really the fault of government for putting too much taxes on, and the developers were being constrained by that, and fees and other things like that. So here comes the private sector to also come in and try to do something about this conflict over the landscape. The third reaction I want to talk about is one that took place in Hong Kong itself. It was by the Canadian Club of Hong Kong. In 1990, they came up with a packet and included a video and question and answers, surveys, a slideshow called Meet with Success. And it was given to all accepted immigrants into Vancouver from Hong Kong. Even though it wasn't, you didn't have to go to this Meet with Success video showing, 90% of the immigrants to Hong Kong did because they thought it came with their visa. So it was in the same, the invitation to Meet with Success came with people's visa from the Commission for Canada. So here, and in this visa, there was in this Meet with Success program, there was a lot of didactic information about Vancouver that was trying to show people coming to Vancouver how to behave, especially vis-a-vis the landscape. So just to give you one example, here's a scene from the video where it's panning over a West Side neighborhood. Looked to me like it was Kerrisdale or West Point Grey, and it says, the narrator says, quote, "This is a Vancouver neighborhood. Residents are very proud of their gardens. Newer, bigger houses are a new trend. Sometimes the new houses look out of place." End quote. Okay, so it's low-key, but a very clear intent that the behavior of people coming to Vancouver should be mediated by, and this is interesting, by a mixture of Hong Kong and business elite, that's who's in the Canadian club in Hong Kong, and the government, Commission for Canada, coming together to try to alter human behavior, so to avoid the genius loci kind of effect. So here we can see in the conflict over the monster houses, three reactions: local government, the law, kind of, if we want to think Foucault, we probably don't, but if you want, a sort of authority, direct sovereignty kind of power operating here. The Laurier Institute, the private sector, discipline, bringing in reason, okay, to think rationally, and then the third reaction, the Canadian business elite and the Canadian government, trying to inculcate a new kind of subjectivity in the immigrants before they even arrive to cause problems in the city. That's a kind of governmentality. So three different forms of power, actions of three different institutions and parts of local government, the private sector, civil society, all dealing with immigration and the conflicts over integration. But interestingly, all at the level of the individual or the personal, dealing with questions of taste and unacceptability, acceptability of the landscape, what's it supposed to look like, really sort of engaging with on the idea of there's fundamental cultural differences here that are creating problems that we need to deal with with using all the different forms of power at our disposal to try to make this problem and go away. None deal with the larger context of the transnational movements of people and capital between Hong Kong and Canada, and the class frictions and class fractions that go along with the economic transformations. So if you think about Meet with Success, for example, it's a clear effort to shape middle-class Hong Kong immigration behavior into a more cosmopolitan taste, okay? So that the transactions between Hong Kong and Canadian business elite don't encounter any frictions. It's an effort to avoid the conflict and blockages impeding the smooth flow of capital, and it's an effort to preempt government interventions like the zoning regulations, the bylaws that are saying how big the houses can be and what kind of house shape and form it can be, et cetera. And the same with the Laurier Institute. It's an effort to shape a cosmopolitan subjectivity in the Canadian subjects so that they also are not going to have to say, oh, it's terrible, this Hong Kong capital, to tarnish the city's image as racist, or to, again, allow the government or to encourage the government to step in to put in various kinds of frictions to the free flow of capital in terms of zoning bylaws, et cetera. So we can see these efforts to shape human behavior on the cultural side as multiply produced and entrained within many different kinds of power, but again, sort of in a way missing the bigger picture. So this takes me to some of the questions that Mike was asking about integration. What is it? What does this mean for me, for policymakers? And I'd say the first thing to think about is that there's an economic and class component to this that's bigger than the sort of cultural questions that planners and academics often seize upon because that's what seems most evident in the landscape. Secondly, the economic questions are not even just in the region, as we heard from last night, you need to think of Vancouver and the broader region, but they're in the entire transformation of the Asia-Pacific. And third, think about in terms of ideological production, the idea of what it means to be Vancouver, what it means to be a good Vancouverite, and the word cosmopolitan, and you can see it's in the actual framing of this panel. Cosmopolitan often is like a necessary good, like that's the starting point. But in fact, if we think about it, West Coast Cosmopolis, the question itself is part of the struggle I'm talking about over ideological production, papering over the absences of what's not talked about, the larger economic picture, in the language of Cosmopolis, in the moral words of Bob Williams from yesterday, who's getting the gravy? These are the kinds of things that when we think about all these kinds of efforts to shape human behavior, to avoid cultural conflict, are sort of eliding the larger context of Vancouver in these economic picture of the Asia Pacific. Thank you.